Hello. Um, I'll have to apologize in advance because my voice sounds like a banshee went through a cheese grater. So hopefully I can make it through. Today, tonight rather, reading a story from Campfire Tales from Crazy Ink Anthology from back in 2019, I believe. I'll be reading my story, The Shadow Riders, for Halloween. So, if, pardon my voice, I sound absolutely horrible. So, let's see if I can get through it. So, story time! Just in time for Halloween. So, alright. So, The Shadow Riders by J.V. Stanley. Yours truly. Alright. The Shadow Riders. Chapter 1. Arbor surrounded herself by dead people. She rather enjoyed their company to others, and even then she thought living people were dead, just noisier. Crickets chirped in the long grass, creating a song with the wind as it flitted the leaves upon the trees and bowed the grass into a rush of sound. The grass was so thick and dense from years of neglect that it surrounded the headstones. She had to dig out the small stone slabs using her hands. She would wrap her fingers along the base of the blades and twist, using her body weight as leverage to pull up large clumps, while careful not to disturb the grave. Arbor? Quincy asked, walking up behind her, with his canvas tote in hand. Mind if I... Looks like someone's used chalk. Might be shaving cream soap? She shook her head. Hard to tell. Looks like the last rubbing was done a while ago, but I can still see the residue on the cracks. See? She ran her finger up and down the large M on the gravestone inside, allowing her hand to drop to the ground. Assholes, she mumbled under her breath. She wore her hair in a ponytail, yet her neck still felt uncomfortably hot and sweaty. She had made herself comfortable at the head of a small gravestone, with her tools spread across the grass in her right-hand side. She loved this hobby more than anything. It made her feel like an archaeologist unearthing secrets of the past. Arbor wasn't the most beautiful of women. Her features were proportionate, but everything about her screamed blah, or so she thought. Her complexion was fair and blemish-free. In her youth, she sported a mouse-brown bob that she continued toting until her junior year at Northern Michigan University, when she finally decided to grow it out. She kept it long and refused to dye it, as opposed to Gabby, who said she'd rather die than to allow a single gray hair to rear its ugly head upon hers. The only feature that stood out uniquely was a silvery patch that framed her face. She started developing a few years after her divorce. She called it her rogue streak, an X-Men reference she loved to use. It made her feel as unique as the character, but reminded her of how lonely and untouchable she thought she was. Quincy knelt down next to her, his knee brushing against her as he shifted. Not assholes, amateurs, he replied. People need to educate themselves before jumping into a new hobby. Yeah, I found the same on the other ones. Was hoping that you had better luck. Arbor shook her head, staring at the tombstone. If someone was going to do something, they ought to do it right the first time, she thought, narrowing her dark eyes. The method may get them what they need or want, rather, but it sure as hell doesn't do the stone any good. This one shouldn't have been rubbed at all. I mean, look at it. I'm afraid to even touch it. There's a lot of old ones here, but they're all in the same condition. Why don't we find another place? Gabby is back at the car. She's just infuriated about this as you are, he said, putting a hand on her shoulder. Looks like all of them have been doused with shaving cream. Ridiculous. Might as well just kick the damn things over, the bunch of... Don't they understand that ruins them? The detergents in shaving cream have chemicals in them that destroy history. Calm down, I know, Quincy urged. The sound of his voice was peculiar and unique in a way that Arbor appreciated. It was like a slick baritone, slightly nasal, but also sounded as though words clenched in his throat. It wasn't a bad sound, just unique. He collapsed to the side slightly, propping his head up on one arm while stretching his legs out in the overgrown grass. He reached over and fingered some moss that had accumulated on the side of the headstone. He pet it with his finger, careful not to peel it off. There was a distinct possibility of chipping away more of the stone if he tried. We're lucky, he sighed, withdrawing his hand. In Massachusetts and some other states, it's illegal to make gravestone rubbings. They're considered to be on par with historical documents, ancient artifacts that ought to be treated respectfully. Arbor snorted. See, this is why you should teach a class on this. Don't snort at me. You know just as much as I do, and you're just as passionate about it. I've never seen someone so dedicated to the dead as you are. Quincy smiled and then reached over and pushed on Arbor's shoulder, knocking her over slightly. She shot him a playful scowl. You have the patience for people that I don't, remember? Yeah, I forgot how much of a people person you are. She allowed a small smile to creep over her face, but tried to hide it by pursing her lips together. His grin only grew wider. Moments later, a small, lithe woman appeared from behind a large stone monument, roughly 15 yards from them. She was dressed in purple shorts with a black spaghetti strap tank top with Nosferatu plastered across the front of it. Her dull beige, overprocessed hair hung like a shrug around her shoulders. She wore thick glasses that made her eyes appear larger than they were, which was saying something considering her eyes were as big as a child's fist. Quincy had always referred to them as cartoon eyes. Hey, Gabby, come to Gab? He smirked, the lines around his eyes deepening. Her expression said it all. Seriously? Quincy, it's been 27 years since we met in high school. You really need to find new material. Quincy looked taken aback. He placed his left hand over his heart, feigning offense. But that's part of my charm. Gabby rolled her eyes. Arbor Henderson had moved to Manistee shortly after she graduated high school, or college. Before that, she lived in Grand Rapids, where she met the man of her dreams, Quincy Scott, and her best friend, sister, Gabby McAdams. The three of them had taken a history class together freshman year and were assigned as a team during class. From then on out, they worked as a team in every aspect of high school and in life. After Arbor moved to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Gabby and Quincy went their separate ways as well, but they met every summer to visit graveyards. The tradition started on Halloween 1996, when they decided to play flashlight tag in the Fulton Street Cemetery. It was Arbor who first noticed the old headstones and became transfixed by the age and beauty of them. From the intricate details of the carvings, craftsmanship, and epitaphs, to the names of people long forgotten. The oldest ones weren't even legible. The Fulton Street Cemetery was the oldest cemetery in Grand Rapids and was at one point in time surrounded by farmland at the eastern edge of a growing settlement. The puritanical pioneer population at the time set up the graveyard in early colonial style with gravestones that were lined up like rows of corn in a cornfield, as opposed to the modern-day park-like atmosphere that is familiar. Quincy was intrigued immediately at the idea of preserving gravestones as a means of preserving historical significance and for sentimental reasons. He believed that everyone deserved to be remembered, a sentiment shared by Arbor as well. Arbor turned and looked at him and watched him looking at Gabby, taking a moment to study his face for what seemed like the 100th time since she had met them both at Drummond Island only 5 short days ago. She loved the wrinkles around his eyes and the mirthful squint he always seemed to have. He was sporting a dark tan, darker than she had ever seen him. Since he took that job working construction at DAANDN, his age started showing, and that was what made him even more attractive. She regarded his every crease as charming. Even when he didn't smile, the lines on his face said otherwise. He never did marry, said he never found the right woman. He had girlfriends, sure, but he never got close enough to any of them to make a real commitment or a connection for that matter. His personality sort of had an on-off switch, too, which took a while for Arbor to get used to. When he was around her and Gabby, he was playful, but to the rest of the world, he was quiet and reserved. He would absorb and observe his surroundings, taking it all in and allowing himself to feel everything, but he wouldn't show it. He said as much to Arbor one day over coffee a lifetime ago. You know something? He had begun. He had sat across the table from Arbor at Deadwood Coffee, their favorite Friday hangout spot. I think you and Gab are my only true friends. Travis is one of my best friends too, but he just doesn't understand me the way you do. Well, what about Gabby? Arbor asked, sipping her cafe au lait. She recoiled as the heat burnt her lip, dribbling a bit of coffee down her chin. She quickly wiped it off, feeling uncharacteristically embarrassed. He nodded. Gabby too. He had paused for a moment, staring absently over her shoulder at something at the wall. He sighed deeply and looked into her eyes, taking a long sip from the large red coffee mug he had cupped within his hands. After a long swallow, he continued, "It's just, you know more about me than she does. I mean, there are things that I can tell you that she just wouldn't understand. Plus, there are things that you know about that she doesn't. I just can't bring myself to." He shook his head, smiling, never leaving her eyes. He couldn't hide the flash of sadness behind them from Arbor, though. "I'm so lucky to have you as my friend and to have you in my life. You know that? Friend." As she stared into eyes almost 3 decades older, the light within them still reflected the same youthful sincerity as they had back then. 27 years and they were still best friends. She was grateful and indeed blessed, albeit disappointed. Gabby stood behind the small ornate gravestone and looked down. "This one defiled too?" "As so amateurs," Arbor caught herself. "You guys want to grab something to eat before we head out to the next site?" She knelt down and carefully began cleaning up Arbor's equipment. "Where's that again?" Quincy asked. "Just north of here. I heard it's by Bond Falls in Ontonagon County, somewhere in the woods out that way. It's an old family plot. A guy I work with at the bank was telling me about it. It's on his family's land. They don't travel to the UP anymore because they've gotten too old, and he just doesn't have the time. He was telling me that there used to be a farmhouse on the property that burnt down mysteriously, and it was close to that." She smiled and wailed like a ghost. "They ended up building a small cabin on it and used it as a camp." She fumbled with the roll of butcher paper, trying to stuff it into Arbor's canvas bag. They all ordered matching totes from a custom website to commemorate 20 years of gravestone hunting 7 years ago. In a large Gothic lettering, she had "The Gravers" imprinted on either side of each tote. It was Gabby's idea. She was always the most sentimental of the three. "Never mind, Gabby, I can get this," Arbor said. She then began placing the scissors, rubbing wax, masking tape, and the non-fusible and medium weight interfacing fabric haphazardly into the bag. Gabby took out the folded fabric and held it up. "You gonna use this or the butcher paper for the rubbings?" "Depends on the gravestones, honestly. I don't like using paper on the older ones. Makes them look more artistic, I think, with the fabric," Arbor replied, standing. She slung the tote over her shoulder and stood over the grave. She looked down at the name, Martin Uriah Green, 1812 to 1824. "A bit pricey, though, comparatively," Gabby said. Arbor put her hands on her hips and stared at the gravestone. "This kid was born in a year of war," she said with a tone of sadness. "Died young. Poor kid was only 12, same age as my daughter. Makes me wonder how it happened." Quincy nodded his head, his attention still on Gabby. Better than construction paper and cheap crayons. He then turned to his attention at Arbor. "A lot of kids don't live long back in those days. Life was unbearably hard, harder in ways that we can't even imagine. The kid was born in the same year a war broke out, too. Talk about unlucky. Losing a child is always hard." Dog's trying to climb on the bed. Gabby took a few steps ahead and put her arms around Arbor from the side, her expression sympathetic. "I know, hon, I know," she said, and then laid her head on her shoulder. After a while, she said, her tone gentle, "She'll come around, I promise. She's not dead." Arbor shrugged Gabby's arm off. "At least I would know where to find her." She walked to the car without another word. Chapter 2. Take a puff of my pipe. It's just tobacco. Doesn't exactly help my voice much, but... Chapter 2. You know that game that we used to play every Halloween? The one we'd play after we'd run amok through the graveyards? Gabby was sitting on the front seat of Arbor's Ford Escape with the door hanging partially open, her short, slim legs propped out of the window. "You mean the one we played where we didn't get lost?" Quincy asked playfully. Gabby scowled, pressing buttons on the navigation system. "No, I know exactly where we are. The reason why it's not showing up on the GPS is because we're on a private road, I think. Either that or the signal's bad. Or because the GPS is trying to kill us. About a couple miles back, if you recall, it told us to make a sharp left off of an embankment, Quincy said, raising his eyebrows. I agree with you there. Technology is trying to kill us, Gabby said. No, I'm talking about the game we used to play where we try to guess what the people did while they were alive. Quincy thought for a moment. Oh, yeah, I remember that. We should do that at the next graveyard. Shouldn't be too far, Arbor replied. I know we're in Paulding. Oh, speaking of, we should check out the Paulding Light while we're there. It's down Robbins Pond Road. The Paulding Light? You'll have to explain that one, Quincy said from the back seat. He sat in the middle and leaned forward between the seats. He looked back and forth between the two women. Arbor cleared her throat, going between gripping the steering wheel to tapping on it out of impatience. We're ready to go yet? She gestured forward and raised her eyebrows. Just a minute, Gabby replied. I think I put in the wrong address. Arbor stopped her rhythmic tapping and turned to the side in the driver's seat to look at Quincy. You know, there's more than just the Paulding Light. I just remembered, she laughed. There is a mysterious disappearing graveyard nearby. We should go and see if we can find it. I think it's down the same road, if not the road before it. We could probably go to both if you wanted, but we should try to find the graveyard first. You still haven't told me what the Paulding Light is, he said. What about the family graveyard? Which one did you want to go to? Gabby asked with a sharp edge to her tone. She was still fumbling with the GPS, trying to input the address. After a few moments, she tossed the GPS onto the dashboard, crossed her arms, and then looked at Arbor expectantly. Okay, so you know your way around here, right? Arbor sighed. Everyone was quiet for a moment, and she could sense the tension. None of the grave sites were working out at all. Most of the older graves were far too weather-worn and deteriorated to chance a rubbing. When in doubt, don't, Quincy would always say. She took another deep breath and then yawned. It was already pushing 5 in the afternoon. She looked down as she heard her stomach rumble. Ignoring the pangs, she looked at Quincy and regarded his expectant expression. Okay, yeah, she began, shifting into the seat again. I can navigate, no problem. Quincy, the Paulding Light is a kind of a legend up here. It's this mysterious glowing light that appears in the forest by some railroad tracks down at the end of Robbins Pond Road. There's a sign down there and everything explaining the unexplained light. Quincy chuckled, his mirthful eyes squinting. Explaining the unexplained? Isn't that an oxymoron? You're a moron, Gabby replied a little too quickly. Arbor and Quincy's mouths dropped simultaneously as they stared wide-eyed at Gabby. I'm sorry, she said, laughing spiritedly. Quincy sat there with his mouth agape until his shoulders shook with laughter. That's it, he said, reaching over and grabbing the GPS. You're fired. Okay, Donald, Arbor said as they all snickered. The sky was bright, but littered with white feathery clouds streaking the heavens, as though painted on with a fan brush. The road was narrow and covered with a canopy of trees, with only spots of sunlight filtering through. Arbor noted the maple and oak trees lining the road, and the large leaves of wild thimbleberry bushes and ferns that comprised the ground cover. Most of the thimbleberry bushes were taller than she, but it was far too early in the season to go berry picking. She, however, made a mental note of the area so she could come back when they were ripe. Much like the coveted morels, she hoped no one else knew of the spot. The air smelled like a clean decay, damp dirt and foliage carpeted with last year's fallen leaves. The back road was a washboard the first few miles, and it was dry. She could see through the rearview mirror the sandstorm the tires had kicked up. Farther down the trail, areas were damp as though it had rained. She noted a large pothole full of water on the edge of the road, with a large assembly of mosquitoes breeding in the dark, muddy pool. The conversation dulled to a quiet lull. Quincy was the first to break the silence. Why don't we try and find that disappearing graveyard and hit up that light while we're at it? Arbor nodded her head as she contemplated the idea. Gabby stuck out her lower lip and sighed loudly as she flipped through the touchscreen GPS. A light. All right, I suppose, she said. We could always hit up this graveyard on our way back, though. Sounds like a plan, Quincy clapped his hands. A sudden sense of unexplainable foreboding swept over Arbor. The feeling struck her stomach like a slug and knotted itself like a thick ball of iron cord curling through her gut. The sensation ascended to her chest, where it unrolled and wrapped itself around her. Her pulse quickened beneath the sudden weight. You all right there? Quincy asked, his expression worrisome. She pressed her fist into her chest. I don't know. I think I'm having a panic attack, and I don't know why. I know why, Gabby began, putting the GPS up on the dashboard clip. It's because of Abby. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have brought her up. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence as Arbor stared past the stop sign, watching a chipmunk scurry across the dirt road, disappearing into the bushes. She attempted to control her breathing, closing her eyes and rubbing her chest, counting her breaths, allowing her shoulders to relax. It's okay. I just want answers. It's been a year and everyone seems to have been giving up on finding her. I was gone for just a minute. Hot tears built a dam between her eyes, and she blinked. It broke, sending trickles of salty tears down her cheek. I was only gone for a minute, she whispered. Gabby narrowed her eyes in a sympathetic concern. I know, honey. You just have to have faith that they'll find her. It's been a year and there's still no word. You know as well as I do that the first 48 hours is vital. After that, they're looking for a... Quincy squeezed her shoulder gently, his expression serious. We'll find her, somehow, some way. We will find her, no matter how long it takes. His sincerity made her tremble as she tried to fight back the tears. Thank you, Quincy. Thank you both. I just can't even... Arbor took a deep breath and put the car into gear. We should probably head out before it gets too late. Chapter 3. 15 minutes later, they pulled into Backard Road. The town seemed quaint, with a few stores dotting the sides of the road. The houses were beautiful, and it reminded Arbor of how she used to drive around town with Abby to look at the houses. They used to tell stories about who lived there, what they did for a living, if the place was haunted, and if so, how. How they used to laugh, a kid-friendly version of what she did with Gabby and Quincy. For 12 years, she and Abby told stories, and since Abby's disappearance, Arbor hadn't touched a book since. Every time she lifted one, felt the edge of the hard cover or the pliability of a paperback, she was swept over in memories that flashed the smiles and laughter they exchanged. Traditions weren't meant to be broken, not the way they had been. The sick feeling in her stomach abated slightly as she glided the car around a small curve. About a mile and a half down the road, she slowed the car to a crawl, pushing the memories to the back of her mind. She had to get her mind off Abby before she allowed herself to be consumed by her memory again. It made her feel guilty, thinking of herself, trying to forget. She didn't want to forget, but it was too painful to remember. Far too painful. The all-consuming feeling that causes one's mind to race into darkness, thinking of the possibilities of what happened and what could have happened. It was the not knowing. It was the lack of closure, but she wasn't even sure if she wanted that, the finality of it. Nothing compares to the loss of a child. Nothing. She and Gabby looked out the open windows, studying the area. They passed a few cornfields, a few houses that were weather-worn and dreary, paint peeling from the wooden shingles, the front steps collapsing or rotting. Most of the houses looked abandoned. Some were boarded up haphazardly with old beams and wood. 10 miles down the road, Gabby shouted and pointed out the window, startling both Arbor and Quincy, who was hunched over his phone in the back seat. Look, over there, see it? Sure enough, a large cemetery appeared alongside the road next to an old farmhouse on the right that was boarded up. She slowed the car to a crawl again and studied the house. It looked like it had been a remarkably beautiful house in the day. Arbor couldn't determine the exact age of the house, but it was old. It, like a few of the other houses in the area, was white with the paint peeling off the shingles. It looked like someone had taken a wire brush to the outside of the house, scraping off the facade, revealing the old gray wood beneath. The front steps were wide enough to seat at least 10 people comfortably, with a wraparound deck, fully equipped with a swing that had fallen off its chain. One shutter swung listlessly in the breeze. The window appeared to be missing. For a moment, as Arbor studied the outside of the house, she could have sworn she had seen the shadow of someone passing by the broken window. Her eyes narrowed and a fresh wave of anxiety hit her. She ignored the feeling, taking a deep breath into her diaphragm and blowing as though she were pushing air through a straw, slow and calculated. That's one hell of a house for a caretaker, if you ask me, Gabby said from the passenger side. I wonder if anyone lives there. Doesn't look like anyone's been there for a while. I hate to see what it looks like on the inside. It might make me cry. I would love to live in a house like that, Arbor said, stopping in front of the house for a moment. She stared into the open window again, wondering if she would catch another glimpse of the figure. Should we go up and knock? Gabby asked. I mean, is this it? I'm not sure. This is a first for me, Arbor responded. I think maybe we should just go ahead and go on in. This might just be a private graveyard. It may be a good idea to check it out and see if someone is there, Quincy piped in. Better to be safe than sorry, and it's only proper. I'm not gonna. You two can go ahead, but I'd rather just take my chances, Arbor said, and took her foot off the brake, allowing the car to move forward on its own. The graveyard itself was hidden behind a thick line of white pine, oak, and maple trees. A few of the maple trees looked as though they had already been tapped to collect sap. Cemetery syrup, she thought, as she drove past. She saw an opening through the trees that appeared to be a trail that led to the grounds. She pulled in front, put the car in park, and killed the engine. Arbor ran her hand across the top of her head, smoothing out the flyaway hairs that tickled her face. She shook her head. You two can go back to the house if you want to, but I'm not stepping foot. Nuh-uh. Quincy remained quiet while Gabby furrowed her brows in contemplation. Well, if we don't stay long, if this is the cemetery you're talking about, then, is this really a good idea? Let's just go, Arbor said, her tone sharp. Quincy threw down his phone and was the first to exit the vehicle. He went around behind the car and hit the top of the trunk a few times. Arbor pressed the button to release the hatch. A few moments later, he slammed it shut, shaking the car. Arbor watched as he carried the totes of supplies down the overgrown path. Guess it's time to go, Gabby said, opening her door and flashing Arbor a worried expression. We'll be in and out. To be honest, this place gives me the creeps, but I don't know. But I know it was my idea. I'm sure we'll be fine so long as we don't linger. Chapter 4. Puffin stuff. Okay, test this. Chapter 4. This just does not want to stay in place, does it? Okay, holy shit, these graves are old, Arbor exclaimed as she examined the last row. She walked amongst them, astonished at the dates. She didn't stray too far from Quincy, who was in the row behind her, muttering his disbelief. Most of the gravestones were stone slabs buried within the earth, and the names and dates appeared to be etched on by hand by a knife. Some were handwritten, while others were etched with elegant script. The graveyard was spotted with large oaks and maple trees, and at the center of the cemetery was a large black wooden cross next to a tall white pine. Arbor walked along the thin path between the rows and read aloud the names and dates that she could read. Some had faded into nothing, but many were surprisingly legible. Eliza Jordan, 1666 to 1675. Giles Montargis, 1618 to 1675. Lazare Lamari, 1645 to 1675. Marguerite Amboise, 1646 to 1675. Jacques Ancillon de la Sabinière, 1642 to 1675. All the gravestones I've read so far, the date of death has been the same, 1675. How much research did you do on this place before you decided to take us here? She asked. I just heard about it. Most of the people here are French. I think I may have stumbled across a few Scott and Irish names, she said, staring at the grave of Ancillon. I know a little bit of the history of the Upper Peninsula, like the Bishop of Baragon, Jacques Marquette. He was a French missionary that set up the first European settlement in Michigan. It was Sault Ste. Marie, I believe, around the year 1700 sometime. I know Michigan was part of the Northwest Territory until about 1800. And Michigan got the Upper Peninsula in 1836. I miss that class. Me too. Maybe they all died the same year because of a plague or something. Maybe a harsh winter that they weren't equipped to deal with so far away from the Sioux. I bet this Ancillon guy was a real heartbreaker, don't you think? I'm thinking he was rich and looking for adventure, bored with his life in Paris. She turned around and looked at him, wondering what he was thinking, and hoped that he would play along. She gasped. This place had to have been an early French settlement of some kind. All the names are French, and the dates go back to the early 17th century. Jesus, he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. I can't believe this. So frickin' wild. He paused and lifted his gaze to meet hers. Wait, what's wrong? You don't have a shadow. Quincy blinked and shook his head. Wait, what? He said, looking down at his feet. What the hell? Wait a minute, Arbor. You don't have one either. She looked down, and the late afternoon sun shone bright around her. She twisted her head around to both sides and let out a whimper. She met his eyes with this look of shock. Well, this is unsettling. We have to leave. Gabby! Quincy yelled, but the only answer came from the gentle hum of crickets. Where is she? Arbor asked. He shook his head. She was just here, only 2 rows behind, right by that big old tree over there. Still have that bad feeling? We both don't have shadows, whereas everything around us does. And everyone in this graveyard, so far, all died the same year. I'm not even sure if it's because I'm tired or if it's because we don't have shadows now or what. I feel like we're in a dream right now. The longer we stay here, the more I think there's something wrong with this place, something dark. Quincy walked over and put his arm around her shoulder, grabbed her tote, slung it around his shoulder, and then led her toward the oak tree to fetch Gabby. They continued to call out for her as they walked through the graves. Arbor stared at the grass as they walked with the sun at their backs and felt sick. They didn't have shadows. She had the feeling that they weren't alone. The feeling was so disturbing that when they came upon the oak tree where Gabby was last seen, Quincy had to reach down and support her by the underside of her arm. She wasn't there. Gabby! Quincy yelled, his voice laced with panic. There was no answer. The hell did she go? He thought aloud. Arbor looked at the ground again, feeling the ground closing distance on her. The trees had shadows. The graveyard had shadows. Everything had a shadow but them. I'm not sure. Let's just take a look around. Maybe she went to the car. Quincy, we have no shadows. What if something happened to her? Then we get her and get help. Nothing happened to her. We're fine. Wait, is that her? She asked, motioning toward an unusual shadow, kneeling in front of the large black crucifix that stood at the center of the cemetery. Let's go check it out, he replied warily. He walked toward the cross, repositioning his arms so he was holding her protectively around the waist. When they had walked halfway there, whoever it was got up and went behind the white pine. They exchanged a look of worry before he let his arm fall from her waist. He quickened his pace, cutting in front of Arbor, and went into a jog, calling out to the figure. When he got to the crucifix, he stood there in horror. Arbor slowed her pace to a walk. As she drew closer, her worries were confirmed. Quincy, what's wrong? He turned and ran full speed toward her. When he reached her, he turned her around and grabbed her hand, urging her to run. She bent forward, stumbling. Quincy, what the hell is going on? We have to call the cops. What? Why? Where's Gabby? Arbor tried to turn around and look, but he wouldn't let her. She tried pulling away, but his grip only tightened until he turned her around again and pulled her tight into his arms, burying his face in her neck. She's gone, he said into her shoulder. What do you mean gone? What the hell, Quincy? People just don't up and disappear. She trailed off, remembering. Abby, she whispered, trying to wriggle out of Quincy's grasp. No, you can't look, he said, but it was too late. Hanging from the cross was the burnt remains of a woman hung upside down, her legs spread apart as though doing the splits across the top, her arms dangling down, nailed to the bottom. Arbor walked forward in shock, her eyes never leaving the grisly scene. The cross wasn't black, it was burned, charred. The woman appeared as though she had been burnt alive. The face was concave, as though it had been beaten through, yet the jaw was intact and hung open in a macabre scream. Arbor let out a scream. She looked away reflexively, but the image was imprinted upon her mind to where she couldn't close her eyes without seeing the half-charred body, the fresh flesh falling in bits, the blood caked and dried. We have to find Gabby and get the hell out of this place. She covered her face in her hands and allowed Quincy to hold her. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, That is Gabby, Arbor. What are you? We have to leave, right now, he said. I think I dropped my phone in the trunk. I can't seem to find it anywhere in my stuff. Gabby, she whispered in a rush. No, it can't be. This isn't real. This isn't happening. Get ready to run, right now, Quincy said, looking over her shoulder. Now. What, run? I can't. Arbor, we have to go on, now. The sun glazed over through the cloud cover, darkening the skies. Everything around them turned varying gradients of blue, black and gray. He half carried, half jogged with Arbor back to the car. They stumbled through the narrow trail, scratching against sharp branches that prodded them as they hurried past. They got halfway down the trail where they should have been able to see the car, but all they saw was a grassy clearing in the woods with a single worn wagon trail. They stopped abruptly, and then Quincy broke out into a run. With renewed energy, she followed, pumping her feet into the ground as the grass grew taller around her. The trees slowly shrank to saplings, while others died and lived. Rotted logs appeared as they saw the wonders of reverse decay as the trees sprang up and reconnected to their corresponding trunks, and life lived and died in reverse. They felt the rush of seasons and weather in all their miserable glory until the world became as fresh as the day Columbus first crossed the ocean. They walked to where the edge of the road should have been and noticed the large, beautiful house down the road being erected. What? It's my fault. It's all my fault, Arbor's voice cracked as hot tears burned lines down her face. It was my idea. I brought us here. And now Gabby is... And now we're just fucking what? Time traveled? Calm down, just calm down, Quincy said, rushing to her, putting his hands on her shoulders. He brought her into an embrace and kissed the top of her head. There has to be a logical explanation for this. Arbor looked behind her and groaned. The cemetery disappeared, and now so have we. Explain that. Behind them, the trees grew into a thick, dense forest. A herd of deer ran through it, and Arbor was suddenly awestruck at the beauty of them. Most of the deer stopped and regarded them before wandering calmly off. Others simply perked up their heads, staring at them intently. A few were brave enough to venture close, although the brave wasn't the word that Arbor was thinking of. It was naivete. They had never been hunted before, not by man, or at least not often enough to be frightened by them. The air smelled different, fresher, a world untouched by man, and she was overcome by a bittersweet beauty of it all. The lump in her throat abated as she listened to the hush of wind as it blew through the trees, and the clean scent hit her senses. Crickets hummed and cicadas buzzed. The forest was alive with sound. Shadows flitted between the trees, dark figures walking. 6 oxen appeared, hauling a covered wagon down the lightly worn wagon trail. You gonna be okay? Quincy asked. So long as you're here. I'm not going anywhere, darling. It'll be a cold day in hell. Maybe that's where we're at. Arbor ran a shaking hand over her hair, smoothing it out. She then began rubbing her temples with her index and middle finger, slowly moving in circles as though trying to rewind her brain. She looked to the ground and saw the shadows of what appeared to be someone to the side of her. She stared in horror. Quincy. Look down there, Quincy said, gesticulating down the path to the covered wagon. Quincy, we still don't have shadows, and now there are 4 shadows next to me. To her left and right, 2 long shadows appeared on each side of her, as though 4 people had walked up and stood right next to her. 3 were the shadows of what she assumed to be men, considering the bulk of the shadows. The other was a young girl wearing a dress. She looked up as the wagon drew closer, noting the dark figure, black as tar, atop of the wagon, holding the reins, flattened against the seat. More elongated shadows moved across the ground, congregating in a circle around them. Chapter 5. She felt lightheaded, like her brain had been pumped full of helium that lifted her up and out of her body. She was floating above them, watching as more long shadows appeared behind them. The silence was deafening. The crickets and birds quieted their music, while the trees stood stock still, with not even a whisper of wind blowing through them. The only sound came from the oxen as they trudged slowly along the path, heading their way. The blood drained from her face, and she could feel the excess blood flow through her body, causing her head to throb. We have to move, Quincy said, swallowing hard as he gaped at the shadows of invisible people around them. His voice had a tremor to it that Arbor didn't like. His strength gave her strength, and his was waning. We have to get out of here now and keep going. Arbor nodded, her complexion a sheer vellum white. Breathing hard, he tried to steady his voice. Don't touch them. Walk around them, and slowly. Okay, she made herself whisper. The words caught in her throat like barbed wire, would catch on flesh. Okay, she nodded and reached for his hand. He took her hand. His was hot and sweaty. He withdrew, wiping his hand upon his jeans, and took it again, leading her out from around the surrounding shadows. They hesitated as they reached the edge of the circle, facing the wagon trail. Pardon me. A large shadow of a man with a hefty girth stood before them. They looked from the shadow to the emptiness in front of them, and then walked carefully through the spots of grass that were illuminated by the sun, whose golden hue had started fading to an orange haze. The shadow shifted, and the left arm reached out for their ankles. Arbor quickly dodged the shadow, her foot missing by just a few inches. Relieved that they were out of the circle, she watched as the shadow shifted position behind her. Quincy and Arbor turned around and watched tentatively. Arms would move to hips, heads would cock to the side, while hips jutted out. The small shadow of a little girl that had stood next to Arbor jumped and bobbed around, swinging its arms back and forth. She felt drunk with fear as she stared at the shadow, swaying side to side as she tried to maintain balance. The shadow of the little girl began skipping around the inside of the circle until the large shadow that had sidestepped reached up a thick arm and pointed at her. Seemingly scolded, the shadow stopped and retreated to her place in the circle. Arbor and Quincy walked around through the trees, dodging shadows that hid between them, watching them. They made their way back to where the graveyard would have been had it not been for the rustic-looking cabins that appeared in its stead. A small brook ran through the left side of the encampment, where 3 large cannons were set up facing out. There was a small structure, which Arbor assumed was the cache of artillery. A large crucifix stood in the center of the encampment, unscathed, the wood fresh and unsullied. They noted the uneven walls built around the small fort, made from planks of wood slapped together to form a primitive perimeter. Arbor's jaw dropped as she studied their current position. This place looks like Fort Wilkins up in Copper Harbor. Something bad happened to these people. Indians? Quincy shot a glance toward the trail, where the group of shadows blocked their path in a great long wall of darkness. Not sure. Could be something different. Whatever happened here, it had to have been something horrific to cause this place to be as haunted as it is. Spanish influenza, typhoid, cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis. Could be anything. We should probably go check out some of these buildings. Maybe we can figure this out. I don't want to go anywhere near them. I'm afraid of what we might find. Arbor shot him a worried look. What if Gabby is... Tears began swelling up behind the back of her eyelids as she closed them. They quivered over her eyes as her body began to shake. Gabby, I named Abby after her. I can't lose her, too. He went to say something, but stopped himself, pursing his lips together. We'll get through this somehow. He then regarded the group of shadows before taking Arbor's hand, leading her to the closest structure. I'm thinking tuberculosis or cholera. Look. He motioned toward a few small structures along the bank of the brook. Privies. The disease spreads through contaminated water. Cholera can kill someone in a matter of days. When they reached the first cabin, Quincy opened the door, and they were met with the most odious scent and the sound of hundreds of flies buzzing around. They recoiled, covering their mouths, and backed away from the door. He kicked it open with his foot. A line of bodies lay sprawled upon a mattresses of straw and hay. There were 2 young men, a woman, and a small child. The beds were covered in what appeared like rice water and was the source of the septic stench. One of the young men lifted an arm and reached out, begging for help. His breathing labored with a thick gurgling sound. The man's arm fell and he laid motionless, his skin a blue-gray. Horrified, they turned around just as a man came up from the behind, startling them enough to let out a cry. He walked through them as though they were the mirage and entered the cabin. The man put a stained cloth handkerchief over his mouth and nose. He had carried a few dead beavers that he placed just outside the door. 2 young men appeared from behind Arbor and Quincy. One was short, stocky, and wore a coonskin hat, while the other was slightly shorter, balancing a rifle pointed to the sky above his right arm. The trappers moved through them, and for a moment Arbor and Quincy became the trappers. Arbor felt as though she had fallen and was looking up at the trapper from the ground. She tried to wriggle free from the man, but it was useless. Her feet attached themselves to his, and she had become his shadow until he moved. The man shuddered. It's unsettling around here, isn't it? The one wearing the coonskin hat said. Too quiet. Cholera. How are the other cabins? The one with the traps asked. His French accent sounded like he had swallowed gravel. Same as this one. Any survivors? The two men shook their heads in unison. The man with the rifle moved forward, releasing the otherworldly attachment, and suddenly she was freed. Did you feel that? Arbor asked, looking to Quincy, whose expression turned into raw terror. Someone ought to bury these poor souls. Seeing as though no one else is around, we're going to have to bury them, my boys, the trapper said, through his handkerchief. We don't have a priest to anoint the graves. Only thing we can do is say a few words and pray that those poor bastards find peace. How many are there? The man with the rifle asked, shifting the weapon, pointing the barrel down, tucking the stock under his arm. The trapper met his son's gaze, tonguing the chewing tobacco he had stuffed in his lower lip. He spat a long stream of brown liquid onto the floor. Looks to be about 50, maybe less. Are we ghosts? Arbor asked, looking from the trappers back to Quincy. He shook his head. I don't know what we are now. I just know we don't belong here. We're going to have to take down these cabins, use a spare wood for coffins. These God-fearing folk ought to have a proper burial, the trapper said, his long beard bouncing as he spoke. We'll burn the rest. Best we keep the disease from spreading. Stay away from the brook. We'll make a sign to warn others that it's contaminated. Arbor and Quincy stared through the open doorway, watching as the trappers searched for shovels so as to build the settlement into a graveyard. Chapter 6. The shadows surrounded the men and watched as they began digging their graves. The moment the shovel hit the ground, the sun came out from behind the clouds, and the world around them fast-forwarded. The 50 shadows blocking the trail ambled quickly toward the three men. As each grave was dug, a shadow appeared behind the men and disappeared into their shadow. More came forward until they were surrounding the men as they had Arbor and Quincy down the trail. The shadows broke away and then reconvened as the men worked. The men looked through belongings in each cabin to determine the names and dates of the people residing within the town. Arbor noted the way they had etched the stones, using sharp stones and the tips of knives. They worked in fast forward, tearing down the cabins until there were skeletons, and burning down the others. The flames licked the crucifix, charring it as a charcoal black. The world spun as the shadows retreated from the trappers and made their way toward Arbor and Quincy. He turned and held on to Arbor, pulling her close as time sped around them. They watched as the cabins burned down to ash, as the trees fell and rotted back into the earth from whence they came. The trappers disappeared, leaving only the graveyard. The sun flashed like a strobe light as the days and nights propelled them forward. The shadows surrounded them, and as Arbor peered over Quincy's shoulder as he embraced her, she noticed his shadow upon the ground, and the spirits as they collected into it. She shuddered and felt a weight within her soul as memories flashed before her eyes. She was riding a horse through the tree line, galloping her way to the west. She was a little girl playing with her fabric dolls next to the hearth. She was the cook preparing meals for the camp. She was the trapper who buried the people. She was the owner of the trading post, talking to the Ojibwa and listening to the hushed barbaric euphemisms they were referred to as. She was a man laying in agony as disease consumed him, every breath a labor, as he died in a swamp of his own feces. She was everything and everyone simultaneously, her mind no longer just hers, but the conglomeration of souls that resided within the small fort. They were riding her shadows, as she was riding the current of thoughts and memories of people centuries old. She felt them tearing through her time as progressed. She felt them tearing through her as time progressed, each one taking their turn to possess her through her shadow. The ground was never consecrated by a priest. A priest needs to anoint the ground. The fire cleansed the earth, but the souls were never truly put to rest. But what happened to Gabby? Had she become a shadow? Her mind flashed to Gabby, hanging burnt upside down on the crucifix. She recoiled at the thought, her mind swimming, floating until she was nothing but a memory. Chapter 7. They re-emerged in the clearing. The mounds of dirt over the bodies created humps, rolling the ground. The car was gone, but the road was there, and they were walking down it, arm in arm. To the onlooker, one would think they were out for a romantic stroll in the cool evening, their shadows plodding along the close behind. It wasn't long before a car pulled up next to them, offering a ride. The driver, a man in his mid-50s driving a forest green Chevy, had given them a ride to the hospital. Arbor used the man's cell phone to call Gabby. It was then that they realized how long they had been gone. "Where were you guys? I looked for hours for you two. You were there, and then suddenly, poof, you disappeared," Gabby exclaimed, throwing her arms around Arbor. The doctors ran a series of tests. They were found to be dehydrated and worn down from exposure. No drugs were found in their system. Gabby had met Arbor and Quincy at the hospital and had contacted authorities the moment she heard Arbor's voice on the other end. "I'm sorry to tell you folks, but there isn't an old graveyard down that way. Just the old farmhouses, cornfields, and forest. That's it. I was trying to explain that to your friend, Gabby, but she insisted that you were there and had walked off." The, the officer looked at them skeptically. You kids do any drugs that evening?" "No, we were just out doing gravestone rubbings. That's it. We told you what happened." Quincy looked at Arbor and then back to the officer. "Did the hospital give you a drug screen?" Arbor was aghast. "We told you already what happened. We've already been. Drug screen us all you want. Give us a lie detector. We know what we saw." The officer rubbed the bridge of his nose before taking their names and phone numbers. He told them he'd be in touch and then walked out of the room. "Did you guys really?" Gabby looked at them expectantly. Quincy regarded Gabby, his tired eyes haunted by reviving the dead. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you," he said, his tone subdued. "I had to file a missing persons report. You guys were gone for a week. I mean, how did you two survive without food or water for an entire week in the forest?" "Gabby, we told you what we told the police," Arbor lied. "There were just some things that cannot be explained, and even if she were to try, she would be met with the same cynical disbelief that the officer had shown them." Gabby sat down on the bed, her shadow shifting on the floor. Arbor cried out when she saw it, startling Gabby. "What is it?" she asked, putting her hand on Arbor's leg. "It's your shadow," Arbor began. She looked to Quincy, who had kept himself in the corner of the room. He sat with his legs crossed, staring off into space, his breathing calm. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, and Arbor savored every breath. Once in a while she would catch the scent of putrescence, as if someone had opened the door to the cabin again, releasing the hot oven-like temperatures that had baked the dead people inside, expediting the process of rot. "What about my shadow?" "It's nothing," Arbor replied, shaking her head. "Like Quincy said, you wouldn't believe us if we told you. I just don't want to go through it again, all right?" Quincy uncrossed his legs and leaned over, resting his elbows upon the tops of his knees. He then cradled his face in his hands, rubbing his eyes. "I just want to put it all behind us." "You don't want to stop our tradition, do you?" Gabby asked, worried. "Not the time, Gab," Quincy said through his hands. "Not the time. I just want to go back down to Grand Rapids. I have to somehow explain all this to my boss. I've already missed 3 days of work." She nodded her head, wringing a piece of Kleenex in her hands. She used it to dab the tears that formed underneath her large glasses, magnifying her pain. "I understand. It was autumn, and the sun peeked its fiery head from the dark clouds circling above. Arbor could smell the rain before it even fell. The scent was clean, inviting, and it felt like it had an electrical charge to it. She could feel it in her bones. She looked at her wall of framed gravestone rubbings that she kept in her living room above the television. Part of her wanted to tear them all down and destroy them, rid herself of the morbidity of the hobby. The other part of her wanted to return to the cemetery with a priest to consecrate the ground. That would perhaps give the poor souls some rest. It had been 2 months since her unexplained disappearance, as the people liked to call it. She had been prescribed a few medications from her therapist for her anxiety and insomnia. She would lay there every night with her eyes open. She would see the dead man reaching out to her. Some nights it was the shadow of the little girl she dreamed of, her and Abby playing dolls together like siblings. When she was awake, all she saw were shadows from the corner of her eye, darting back and forth, startling her. It would be the plant in the corner, with the sun filtering through the leaves, the fan causing the shadows to jump. It would be the shadows across the road as she drove, startling her attention. Quincy was lucky that he didn't lose his job, but he hadn't returned any of her calls since the incident, and Arbor grew worried. She spoke to Gabby almost regularly, and even she hadn't seen him for more than a few minutes at a time, he would avoid the topic like the plague, she'd say, which made Arbor flinch. She saw the man as he reached out, his bluish-gray face and his clouded eyes, the rising scent to her nose. She picked up her tote from the corner and set it next to her. She hadn't touched her graveyard rubbing since. She had simply walked into the house and allowed the tote to fall from her shoulder the moment she stepped through the door, and it stayed there. She had stared at the tote for the past week, debating on whether or not she should break out the ironing board and melt the wax into the fabric from the rubbings she had done before she disappeared. She rummaged through the fabric, examining each rubbing. At the bottom of the bag, she came across something peculiar, a thick piece of old linen neatly folded up at the bottom of the bag. She picked it up and picked up the stack of material and unwrapped it. It had been tied with twine, as though it had been hidden there purposefully. Her jaw went slack as she unfolded the fabric. Eliza Durden, 1666 to 1675. Giles Montargis, 1618 to 1675. Lazare Lamari, 1645 to 1675. Marguerite Amboise, 1646 to 1675. Jacques Ancelon de la Sabinière, 1642 to 1675. It was the same grave markers that she had been examining at the graveyard, the same she had read aloud to herself in Quincy, but she didn't do any robbings while she was there. Her calm disturbed by this find, she grappled for her phone and when a shadow crept across the edge of the hallway to Abby's bedroom. Arbor couldn't stomach the idea of packing up her daughter's clothes and belongings. They were as she left them, untouched by anyone other than Abby. "Mommy?" A whisper came from the dark, barely audible, but Arbor knew what she had heard. She stood, allowing the old fabric to fall from the top of her legs into a pile on the floor. She watched as the top of the head appeared long, as though she had the sun at her back. The shadow appeared at the doorway just inside the living room next to the lamp. It had rained the day Abby disappeared. She had worn matching polka dot galoshes and a raincoat and wanted to play outside in the puddles. "Go on ahead and go, honey. Just don't talk to strangers," Arbor had warned her before she watched her daughter slip out the front door for the very last time. "I love you, Mama," Abby had said, peeking in through the doorway, her hair a mess of curls underneath the hood. "I love you too, honey." The shadow crawled across the floor to the front door, where Arbor creaked it open. She rushed to the edge of the hallway, where she saw the door open and close, and then creak open again, just enough to allow a small head to peek through. "I love you too, honey," Arbor said, and collapsed onto the floor. Shadows crawled out from behind hers as she bowed her head and cried. They climbed the walls, rushed into corners, and slipped down the dark hallway toward the bedrooms. The shadow of a little girl wearing a dress slipped out from Arbor's shadow and appeared next to her, holding a rag doll in one limp hand. Arbor turned to the shadow as a lump formed in her throat. The dead crave life, no matter what kind of life it is. They ride the shadows and latch onto what life they can. The end. So I hope you guys enjoyed the scary story, Campfire Tale. Happy Halloween, and I'll be posting more stories here and there. I don't have a set time or anything like that, so just keep a watch on the channel. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. And let me know what you think of the story in the comments down below. If you have any suggestions or anything like that, let me know. Happy Halloween, take care, and thanks for listening.